Welcome everyone to our 15th continuing education webinar from CoreCHI. This is a free opportunity that we're happy to offer to our certificates, candidates, and anybody who is able to join us. My name is Natalya Mytareva, and today I'm wearing a hat of a guest trainer. But of course, many of you know that I'm also the executive director of CoreCHI. But today is my official vacation, and I am just volunteering to be with you. The topic of today's webinar is Mastering Simultaneous Interpreting in Healthcare Settings. And the reason I chose it is because many of our candidates are nervous when they take certification exams and think that simultaneous part of the exam is the most difficult. Many of interpreters, especially beginners in healthcare settings, haven't done simultaneous interpreting on the job, even, though they passed the exam. So this is a good skill to refresh your knowledge about and to practice and to learn from others how other interpreters practice their skills, even if they don't do it daily on the job. A few words about logistics before we start. The first thing is that we will email you the certificate. It will be in the body of the email message. It will not be an attachment. And if you are our certificate, you need to upload it as a PDF file or an image file. I can tell you the easiest way, if you are technologically different than the youngsters we have around, just display the email on your screen, take a picture with your cell phone and upload that picture. That's the most efficient and easiest way to save it in the correct format, because if you attach it as email file, we may not be able to open it. The recording will be available, but only to those who missed this free webinar. It will be available on our CoreCHIinterpreters.org website. This means that they'll have to pay a fee. And because this is something that is an auxiliary service of CoreCHI, we don't necessarily do it very quickly. So in about 4 weeks, this recording will be available. The email with the certificate will come from the email address info@CoreCHIcertification.org. Make sure it's not in your spam. If you find it in your spam, then right-click and make it either preferred sender or non-spam or friend, whichever email system you're using, so that next time that email does not go to spam. This was, an old slide, but you will get the email with the certificate by January 5th, 2019. And just because I'm a Russian and Russians celebrate the New Year's Eve and New Year's Day as the major holiday of the year, so that's why there will be a slight delay in me sending out the certificates to you. As far as your controls, if it's the first time on your webinar, then your controls may look like this. That means they're folded. If you click on this orange arrow, it'll unfold and you will see different things, including this setting set questions. And here it says enter a question for staff. That's where you can type in your comments during the webinar. If you have a more modern version of the GoToWebinar software, then this is how the control panel will look for you. And when you click on this button with a question mark, here again you will type ask a question, and I'll be able to see you. You yourself do not see each other's questions, only the presenter can see them. Also, I know you have already a question in your mind. Will I have handouts? Yes, and they are already available to you. If in your controls you will look at the line saying handouts. It's already there. It's a PDF file which starts with today's date and then goes simultaneous interpreting. Don't open it now, but I'll remind you at the end of the webinar to download it or download it during the slow moment. On the phone or tablet, this kind of pop-up looks a little different, but it's there. You just need to look for the word handouts. It will be like 1 of 5. There is only one handout there, which has PDF of today's presentation. All right, that's the housekeeping. As far as why am I qualified to talk to you about simultaneous interpreting, I started my career as an instructor and senior instructor at a university in Russia, Volgograd State University, where I taught English, Russian interpreting and translation courses to students of interpreting and translation, to students of law, to others. I also had my started my interpreting career also in Russia, and there my interpreting career was exclusively conference and business interpreting. And only when I moved to the United States, I started interpreting in a non-conference setting. So if you're familiar with conference interpreting, simultaneous mode is a must to have. I can tell you I was horrified and petrified when I needed to take and pass my simultaneous interpreting course studying for my master's at a university, but I did pass it with an A. So in other words, jokes aside, I think it's important for any instructor who teaches something to be able to do it. I can tell you that right now I probably cannot do conference interpreting simultaneously, but I still try to keep up my simultaneous interpreting skills for healthcare because they are slightly different than for conference interpreting. And we will talk about that today. So how will we work? First, for about good hour, I will be talking about the dissecting simultaneous interpreting. When is it appropriate to be used in healthcare settings? What is the communicative intent of different types of discourses that we interpret simultaneously in healthcare settings? What are the linguistic characteristics of different types of discourse that we use for simultaneous interpreting in healthcare settings? What subskills does the interpreter have to have in order to be successful as a simultaneous interpreter? And how do you improve your subskills? And somewhere, in between these 5 topics, we will have the practice. So let's start with the fundamental question, and please feel free to type in your ideas. So why do we switch to the simultaneous interpreting mode in healthcare when we most of the time do consecutive interpreting? Yeah, to keep up. That's number one reason, because we cannot control the pace of the speaker, right? And at that point, the beginner interpreter starts panicking. The interpreter who is already has experience, they switch to simultaneous interpreting mode because depending on the situation, it's either impossible or inappropriate to pause the speaker and ask them to stop or slow down, because we always can do it, we think, but not in healthcare settings. And then the second reason, obviously, is to maintain accuracy. Right? Because theoretically, if a speaker speaks too fast, you can just, if you're not an interpreter, you will sit and listen and then you will summarize in 5 words, right? But that's not what professional interpreters do. And for that reason, there are just 2 important factors that push us to switch to simultaneous interpreting: the speed of the speaker and the need to maintain accuracy, because our memory cannot keep up everything that speaker is saying. So let's first discuss when we use simultaneous interpreting mode in healthcare settings and when it's most appropriate to use. Well, first of all, we need to separate the two. whether we interpret into English or into the patient's language. So if we look at the interpreting into English, the first situation where we must switch to simultaneous really is when the patient or their family member is emotionally agitated and cannot reasonably pause. Here we need to pay special attention to the situations with mental health patients, because sometimes switching to simultaneous may be counterproductive and actually confuse them more. And we also need to pay attention to geriatric and pediatric patients that in switching to simultaneous mode, instead of helping, may cause them to stop talking completely. So you, as an interpreter, walking into the situation, always assess your possibility and necessity to switch. And if you cannot, that's when you would have to very quickly inform the provider that, in this situation, you will have to summarize, because you cannot do simultaneous in order not to confuse a geriatric or pediatric patient, for example. Ideally, you will discuss all that before you even get to the encounter, but sometimes life is not ideal, right? So the next situation when we need to switch to simultaneous mode is when patient is disfluent and speaks relatively fast, because sometimes disfluent patient could be more or less catatonic and speak very, very slowly. Then it will be pretty much consecutive. But if they speak fast, and by disfluency I mean they don't have cohesive thoughts or cohesive sentences that you hear that our brain can process as having meaning. So disfluent means that simply they have disjointed thinking process, disconnected thinking process going on. So usually the patient's in a psychotic moment. When we interpret from English into the patient language, then the simultaneous interpreting mode is used in emergency care, especially trauma, when you have too many providers speaking, and we're interpreting only for one person at a time. But because those comments come in so fast and we cannot control who's going to say what, we need to switch to that mode. In group therapy sessions, right, when the majority of patients are English speaking and you're interpreting just for your non-English speaking patients sitting next to them, you're doing probably more of a whispering interpreting, but whispering interpreting is not actually a mode. It's still simultaneous mode, just delivered in a adjusted version. And we're doing simultaneous when the clinician is speaking to the group and when the other participants are speaking in English. As soon as the questions are addressed to your patient, or the patient wants to participate in the conversations, that's when we switch back to consecutive. And then the third mode is the closest mode to conference interpreting. That is when we have group patient education sessions, when again the majority of the group consists of English speaking patients and you're interpreting for one or two non-English speaking patients. Now that we know when we're doing it, let's think of the communicative intent. In other words, why, what is the speaker trying to convey, and how can we help the speaker convey that when we switch to the simultaneous mode. Also, the communicative intent gives us understanding what is the purpose and intent of the speaker, helps us allocate our resources, our brain power, to certain aspects of simultaneous interpreting without overtaxing ourselves. Because the important thing is we always focus on what's the most important thing to do. That's what we deliver. And then what's nice to have, if we have the time, we deal with that part of the interpreting or the speech of the speaker. So again, let's start with into English. So you are interpreting for the patient when you need to do it simultaneously. And let's start with the first type of situation. We have an agitated patient or an agitated non-English speaking family member. So the purpose or the expectation that we have from the provider when the patient, English-speaking patient, does that, right? When the English-speaking patient either gets angry or emotional or starts crying, the provider's role is to offer comfort to that patient and to de-escalate the situation if it's a situation of anger as soon as possible. As an interpreter who connects the patient and the provider, our communicative goal is to convey emotions of the speaker, convey their intensity, by doing that, we are allowing the provider to act on what they hear, right? It's very important that we convey that intensity because usually when patients are getting agitated, are talking and getting either angry or otherwise anxious or otherwise emotional, it is a good sign that they cannot control themselves because most of the time we deal with patients who are rational, right? And when they get to this state, it is important that we convey that through simultaneous interpreting. And what it means that the actual word choices, the sentence structures, whether it's a demand or a question or a request, all this is very important in this situation because that would allow the provider to offer comfort or de-escalate appropriately. And if the, let's say, angry patient continues to get more and more emotionally agitated, then our communicative goal becomes to convey the urgency of taking safety measures, while the provider's reaction and expectation is to seek these safety measures and de-escalate again. Think of when we have an English-speaking patient and an English-speaking provider. The provider, right the moment the patient starts talking, understands that, okay, this is the moment to call security, right? So this is the moment to see how am I positioning myself. Can I get to that room quickly enough before the patient can grab me and do harm to me? So when we add the interpreter to that equation, because the patient doesn't speak English, the interpreter, act as that conduit of this escalation of the situation, and it's very important for us to convey this so that the safety measures could be taken. Because remember, we're not providers. We ourselves cannot just stop interpreting and call security. We need to interpret so accurately that the provider starts sensing, okay, this is the time to call security. And I think we oftentimes overlook this importance of knowing how to interpret simultaneously because it doesn't happen often. And that's absolutely fair, but it's better always to be prepared. And let's say, what happens if you're a novice interpreter, have not ever done simultaneous, and you get in this kind of situation? Then obviously you can just first say call security and then start interpreting, right? Because the safety is more important than anything else in that situation. But next time you will learn and study and improve your simultaneous interpreting skills, so you don't have to do that kind of intervention which is outside of our role as interpreters, and instead we'll be interpreting it and they let the provider perform their role in all aspects of it. Now, the next situation is when we deal with disfluent or psychotic patient. For the provider, when they deal with an English-speaking patient who is psychotic, they're listening in to see whether what the patient is saying is important for diagnosis, or whether, again, some changes need to be made in the treatment plan, etc. So as an interpreter, we need to interpret simultaneously whatever we hear in order to convey disfluency. That's our communicative goal, because we just need to indicate to the provider that the patient is not making sense. Obviously, it is harder to do, and it is not something that conference interpreters ever have to deal with. However, court interpreters and legal interpreters have have to deal with that because especially if they are participating at the time of arrest or interpreting for inmates in the holding facilities when they're still detoxing, etc. So there are there is an intersection with the court interpreting in this particular moment. Sometimes we also need to, our goal with simultaneous interpreting for psychotic patient is to convey specific imagery or cultural references. And it is our expectation, and it should be your expectation, that you interpret for a psychotic patient anywhere between 40 seconds to a minute, and then the provider should indicate to you that if they need you to continue or not. Because in the same situation with the English-speaking patient, the provider would either tune themselves out and do whatever it is that they needed to do, or they will try to change the patient's attention, or they pursue other, actions by giving them medication, etc., etc. So, in other words, with the English-speaking patient, the provider will not be sitting and listening to the disfluent patient for 20 minutes, right? Same thing with the non-English speaking patient, and it's important for you to, if you already lasted by your estimate over a minute, this would be the good point to check in, intervene and check in with the provider. Do you need me to continue interpreting? Because if you work in mental health, providers usually would stop you at that point. Same thing though, if the psychotic patient is getting their actions or words get more and more unsafe sounding and violent, that's when our main communicative goal becomes to convey the urgency of taking safety measures to the point of intervention again, because ultimately both this is the safety is personal safety, safety of the provider, safety of the patient. This is something where as in many other functions, absolutely equal with the provider, and it is as important to us as it is to them. However, by interpreting simultaneously and being accurate, not only in word choices, but also in the intonation, that's how we could perform that role of being, conveying this possibly unsafe situation coming on. Now let's look at situations when we interpret simultaneously from English, in other words, for the provider, into the patient's language. The number one situation is emergency care, and that is if you work in the emergency room, of course. And here what happens is we have multiple providers usually who are doing different things to the patient. And the purpose or the expectation for whom we are interpreting, either for the patient or for the family, is to be included in the process, to be aware of what's going on around them, and hopefully by hearing and understanding of what others are saying around them, they would feel comforted. Because imagine yourself in an emergency room when you hear everything in English, you even hear what's, said in the nearby behind the curtain to the other patient. So the non-English speaking patient should not be left, so to speak, deaf because nobody's interpreting for them. So when you're there, you are interpreting everything you hear as you would in any other healthcare situation. And your communicative goal at this point is to inform the patient or the family member of the provider's action while there is really no response required from them. It is like a unidirectional simultaneous interpreting, because as soon as the patient starts speaking something, you switch to consecutive to whoever the closest provider is to that patient at the moment. The situation with a group therapy session, or when we have a patient education session, they're very close together. the point of the expectation from the patient's side is that they are included in that conversation. They're not just sitting there, they're actually listening to what others are saying, and you interpreting for them simultaneously all the interactions that are happening, allow them to engage as well. And so again, your communicative goal is to inform of all the statements, all that discussion that is going on between the provider and other patients. As you can see, these situations are very different from each other, and because of that, they have different linguistic characteristics. And one of the most interesting parts of simultaneous interpreting is that it really does differ depending on where you use it, whether you're a court interpreter or conference interpreter, or if or entertainment interpreter for that matter, or if you're interpreting in healthcare settings. So again, let's take it one situation at a time. We're going into English. In other words, we're interpreting what the patient is saying. And if we're dealing with the agitated patient, what you usually will encounter would be vocabulary that is typical of emotional speech. Different words, expressions, including obscenities, threats that we use when we cannot control our emotions. Obviously, if the patient's language is your native language, you have an advantage here because you grew up and you learn all the good and bad words with it. If, however, you are a native English speaker, this is the hardest part probably of the simultaneous interpreting, because you may not have been exposed to the variety of different lexical expressions of this kind of emotions, because that's where you can hear slang, that's where you can hear non-usual, very colorful ways of offending somebody. To prepare for that, obviously you need to study this type of vocabulary. Luckily now with YouTube, with access to different soap operas online, you can do that if you're a native English speaker. But for those of us whose native language is the patient's language, it's not that hard. However, what could be hard for us is expressing the degree of offensiveness into English, right? Because we're all, the good part is the F word in English will cover most of obscenities in any other language, right? So you don't have to focus on that. What you're focusing on is the intended meaning. So if the F word is not by the patient, is really not meant to offend and it's not really escalating that much, then you still interpret it, but you don't emphasize it with your prosody and intonation. But if in the patient's language, the obscenities or threats, offensive words, are really meant to hurt or to express that they're getting out of control, then you will need to be thinking on your feet how you will convey that intensity in English. The grammar will be typical of emotional speech. In other words, it will not be very complex sentences. They will be short sentences, exclamations, questions, pretty short to the point statements. And the important part when you interpret is to keep the grammar structure correctly. In other words, if the patient is stating something, whether with the means of intonation or word order in their language as a demand, don't make it a polite request, right? If they are really being sarcastic and it's more of an exclamation, don't make it a question that the doctor will start answering. So pay attention to the grammar structure and keep that grammar structure when you are interpreting. Yes, obviously, when you have in this situation, if they start using jokes and different, idiomatic sayings, then you need to, because you don't have time in simultaneous to be a very good joke interpreter, you have to focus on the meaning. And if the meaning was, again, violent and offensive, you can convey it through other means, not necessarily sticking close to the joke or the idiomatic saying that the patient is using. Because the most important thing, remember, is to give the provider that chance to understand when the patient, from being simply upset, becomes violent, and safety measures need to be taken. Then agitated intonation. Here it's important is that we need to reflect the source language intonation without mimicking it, right? Because you don't want the patient to start getting angry at you, saying like, why are you mocking me, right? It's important that you reflect either the anxiety or the urgency, but as far as the volume, you need to stay neutral. So your voice could be firm, you could speak and also shorter and faster, but you should not get louder, because believe me, the doctor hears that the patient is yelling. You don't need to yell on their behalf as well. And SL means source language. TL, target language, SL, source language. I'm sorry, I abbreviated it to keep it short in the table here. Well, let's talk about the disfluent and psychotic patient. Here, where there's no advantage or disadvantage really to anybody, except for, of course, as a native speaker of the patient's language, you will have better vocabulary. But the choice of words of psychotic patients in that psychotic moment are not determined by any logic. So you cannot expect them. They are unusual. They may be made up words. And here the non-native speakers will be at a disadvantage, because you would think you don't know the word. Well, in fact, it will be the word which simply doesn't exist. And the patient is just trying to either imitate the sounds or something else. So what do we do in this case? We have a beautiful English word. Remember, we're interpreting into English. It's called, the word is something. So when you're interpreting for disfluent patient, your interpreting may go like, today is a beautiful something something and something something. The fish is swimming deep, jumping something something. That's what it may sound like to the doctor, because you will simply not understand what the patient is saying. However, it's important that you keep saying the word something, because that keeps you in the zone of focus. As soon as you stop in simultaneous mode and start thinking, what did he say? Did he really mean it? You cannot ask for clarification in this particular situation. So you are there, you were trusted to come to interpret for that patient, so you have your experience, you have your knowledge, and if you need to use the word something, that means you have pretty good reason to doing that. So trust yourself that your brain will produce all the words that is possible to produce in that situation, and if nothing comes to your mind, say something so your thought flow continues to flow. However, it's important that after that kind of encounter, especially if it's the first time the provider experienced a simultaneous interpreting of this kind, that you will clarify to them what that something meant. It doesn't mean that you simply don't know how to interpret, right? It was just, yes, you were unprepared for the situation. The words that were coming out of that patient's mouth were either unintelligible, right? You can say something unintelligible, something, but sometimes in that moment, you won't have the time to explain. But afterwards, I do encourage you to clarify this to the provider. It won't take more than 20 seconds. You don't need to have a big lecture about this. You can just, say that this is the limitations of human interpreting because of the situation. As far as grammar, when we deal with disfluent psychotic patients, the major reason why we have to go simultaneous here is because they would speak in disconnected sentences. Our brain is a beautiful thing. It likes logic, it likes connection, and if there is no connection, then our mind cannot keep that in its memory, and we cannot interpret consecutively for that reason. So with simultaneous, because our attention span is on very discrete, very short chunks, we could do that even if the speech of the patient doesn't make any sense. And here, the main advice I can give you: don't try to make sense of it. Just be that, voice without processing it, because that is simply impossible. And here again, if it's impossible to interpret, describe. And the description could be, patient is using words that combine different grammar forms in my language, and they really don't exist. And then switch to something. So don't do too many explanations. And remember, I said earlier, 40 seconds to 60 seconds of that, and the provider should stop you, because it is simply, you gave them the flavor, you gave them the idea of what the patient is saying, and they need to make a decision what they want to do with that. The other challenge you may encounter is either agitated intonation, when the person speaks so fast they're eating the ending of the word endings, or they are very monotonous, or like the opposite of emotional, right? Or they would talk in spurts, right? Like they're choppy. So you need to do neutral intonation, trying to match the prosody and describe peculiar things like chanting, right? Like at this point, it sounds like they're praying or as if they're chanting, because if you share the culture of the patient, it'll be a little easier for you to make that call. If you're a non-native speaker of the patient's language, obviously, you may not even pick up. So that's okay. You will then debrief with yourself and think of all these things afterwards. But in the moment, if you don't know something, you cannot obviously comment on that or explain that, and give yourself permission to do that, right? You are not able to know every single patient, and you are not able to know every cultural aspect of every language. Doesn't matter whether you're a native speaker or non-native speaker of that language. And last but not least, the volume may fluctuate with psychotic patients. They may speak just too softly, and it will be impossible to hear it. And that's what you have to tell them to the provider. If you don't understand, it's like, it's so soft I cannot understand. But you yourself, again, use neutral volume, and try to not to attract attention to yourself. Because if your volume is too loud, or if your intonation becomes too close to the patient's intonation, their attention may switch to you, and your your goal in this encounter is to help the provider assess the patient and the patient express themselves, not for you to become that focus of attention of the patient. So that's one of these things when it's good for us to disappear, maybe virtually, if not physically. But it's important, to be aware of that, and to practice interpreting with this neutral intonation and neutral volume if you are often interpreting in mental health settings, or often interpret for psychotic patients, because that's definitely a skill that is trainable and obtainable, but we're not born with it. Now let's do a little practice. just to get you the feel of that psychotic patient. That's what I will try to imitate. Well, not quite, but how I propose we do it. Yes, feel free to make notes, but remember we're practicing simultaneous interpreting, and because we're a multilingual group here, I'll be doing it in English. So it's, even though it's a patient speaking, but it'll be an English speaking patient, and you'd like you to interpret it into your working language, Russian, Spanish, Arabic, whatever is your non-English most dominant language is. If you no, I cannot hear you, you will have to be your own judge how good you did, right? You can grab a phone and find a recording app and start recording yourself, and then after the webinar listen to it. Or you can just, or if you're doing ASL, obviously you can, just do it without audio recording. If you don't want to deal with technology today, just try to interpret simultaneously, but also kind of monitor what you're saying, so you can give us feedback on how it felt. Okay, so I'm going to start in one, and as soon as I start, give me 2-3 seconds and start interpreting. Remember, because it's a psychotic patient, you are allowed to say something when you don't understand what I'm saying. Also, remember that because it is a patient who doesn't know what they're talking about, you don't need to make sense of all that, and just let it go. So 1, 2, 3. I feel like a unicorn just took me on a ride to a magical palace, to the land of blueberries, and we eat onions all day and mushrooms, and sometimes, if we're lucky, we get papayas. And he flies me around, and I hang on to the unicorn, and we float away to the land of AIDS, and we float, float, float. Who is in the house? JC, tell me who is in the house? JC, who was born to a virgin named Mary on Christmas Day. He bled and he just died on the cross to take sin away. Take him high, take him low, you take JC wherever you go. Now tell me who is in the house? JC, Jesus Christ is in the house today. Are you okay? Do you hear? I don't hear you popping in on my gospel. I'm kind of thirsty. It's peculiar, quite peculiar. All right, guys, how did it feel? You can type in your comments now. Yes, exactly. It felt stressful, interesting, horrible, and you feel like, I don't know what, if I ever, even interpreting, right? It's okay, because that's how it feels the first time you really encounter it. And I chose actually a transcription from a YouTube video. Do a search after the webinar to type in unicorn tooth, and you'll have the video of it was an English patient who is recovering from a general anesthesia after the tooth extraction. Yes, I did it easy because I really, tried to enunciate every word. In real life, you would not hear everything that I said. And also, even though I tried to sing, but I'm not a singer, so that gospel song that she's singing was more like a, I don't know, rap or something in my version. But anyway, that is what disfluency is, right? And this patient is fully normal. They were just coming out of anesthesia. So my point is, in healthcare setting, you never know when you have to interpret simultaneously, right? You went for a dental appointment, tooth extraction, and this is what you had to interpret. The good thing is, after about, interpreting for 20 seconds, the doctor will start smiling and say, okay, she's out of it, calm down. So that's, the way that providers usually handle it. And when she says she's thirsty, that's the important piece which actually is meaningful. And then the provider may decide if they are allowed to give any, rinse the mouth at this point or whatever. But it is very important that you do these kind of fun practices with YouTube videos, or write up your own things and then, record them yourself and have a listen to them and try to do simultaneous interpreting, because it's very hard in the moment, if you're not daily interpreting on the psychotic ward, to be prepared to interpret simultaneously like that. And luckily, most of us don't do that on a daily basis. And I highly respect interpreters who do work in mental health settings and who do deal with this on a daily or weekly basis, because it is truly hard. It is hard on our brain. It is also hard on our self-esteem, obviously, right? Because you cannot expect words, and you just need to be that whisperer, so to say, to just repeat them without processing them. Now let's think about interpreting simultaneously. What are the linguistic characteristics of the speech when we interpret from English, in other words, to the patient? In the emergency care, especially in the trauma ER, the challenge will be medical terms, but at the same time, that's the easiest part to prepare for, right? Just go to emergency room, observe for a couple of times yourself. You will know pretty much what they do in which order, right? Or read a textbook. There are tons of YouTube videos, there are tons of articles about it. So it's actually quite easy, because the terms, once you know them, they are repetitive, the actions are repetitive. All emergency medical personnel is trained to do the same thing the same way. So the injuries will be different, but what they're doing is repetitive and similar from patient to patient. You just need to know that. If you're a beginner interpreter, this is the easiest thing to prepare, and I suggest do it the first thing, because you have this out of the way and you're ready for emergency room interpreting. And if in the moment, though, you get a word that you don't know, because you really don't have that many chances to clarify, just keep it in English. I put here in brackets, clarify if possible. Ideally, if you could place yourself next to the recording nurse, that's the person who is recording what's happening in which sequence and how much is given as far as medications, then ask that person to clarify what is that, if there is time, obviously. The good thing also about this type of interpreting is that providers usually are talking with short sentences. They pretty much talk to each other, trying to coordinate things. Yes, sometimes they will ask something of the patient, but that would be a very normal sentence. There is no challenges here as far as grammar is concerned. It is fast-paced, and many different people speak at the same time. Well, you just choose the one that has the most communicative value. And yes, it is your professional call who is the most important person to interpret if literally two people are speaking at the same time. The worst thing would be to be silent, because then the patient is cut off. Remember, you're already in agony. If you're conscious, you hear people talking about around you in the foreign language. You don't know, are they going to cut off your legs or what? So just find the speaker with the most communicative value. In other words, not the person who is asked, like, give me this, give me that, but instead somebody who is saying, like, well, the blood pressure is good. Now it's the time to give this. So, and that's the person you'll be interpreting for, because it's also the situation when you cannot tell the provider, please speak one person at a time. That just simply is not going to happen. The key is to come into the situation prepared like that psychologically, so you are not overwhelmed by the situation yourself, because you are there to work, not to be affected by the situation. Now, the volume obviously may fluctuate. People standing farther from the patient or from you will not hear them as well. There will be maybe external noise. So you don't add to that noise. You use neutral volume, depending on who you're interpreting for the patient or the family member. You stay closer to them as much as possible and just speak at the normal volume that allows them to hear you. Keep an eye on the equipment around and on people going in and out, so you are not in their way, and be prepared to move. If you're a sign language interpreter, then obviously you have additional layer of things to think about, that you could see if somebody is signing and they could see you. So there are more challenges, but these are challenges that you deal with in other situations as well. While for us, spoken interpreters, it's mostly about the volume. Now, when we deal with group therapy session, here again, YouTube is a brilliant invention for interpreters. Find videos which, show you this group therapy session if you have never been part of one. Of course, there are movies which show them, but movies are staged, right? You try to find the ones which are realistic, and which you will see there. It's not like people are talking there in very complicated sentences, but what's important is, the provider observes the group and tries them to get to talk without getting, seriously upset or disrespectful to each other. But there will be some nuances of feelings, emotions, hesitations that you will need to convey, and stay close to these choices of words and meanings, because this is one of these cases where words matter. And especially if it's a sort of support group for your patient, it's important for your patient to feel as part of the group, that their feelings are not unique, that other people in the group share them. They're also hesitant. They either get, too wordy or very short. So, in other words, your goal in this situation to make your patient feel as if they're truly a part of that group. And that's what's done through words. And it's important that if you're assigned to interpret for group therapy sessions, regardless of what their intent is, to meet with the facilitator, whether with the clinician who is going to lead this group ahead of time, and really ask them what's the purpose, so that you truly know what to expect and what the purpose is. Especially if your patient is joining already a group kind of not from the very beginning, there may be some group dynamics that the provider could warn you about. So do find the time to do that, because our voice and the way we're handling this is affecting the effectiveness of this type of care that patient is getting. Sentence types vary, obviously, right? Stay close to what you hear, because either the speakers will be intentionally using, turning every sentence into a question, even though with the intonation, right, if it's possible. So make sure you're close. Again, your part is to recreate that atmosphere that other participants are experiencing for your non-English speaking patient. With intonation, stay close to source language intonation, because if some person is very, unemotional, you need to reproduce that. And if the other one is the opposite, you need to reproduce that as well. Here, there's a difference from trauma ER. If two people speak at the same time, ask the provider to intervene and have one person speaking at a time, because this is just the normal group facilitation. This is not a situation when people should speak at the same time, and you need to have this under control. It's not up to you to do this, monitor who speaks when, but you need to. That's another part of your pre-session with the provider, is to tell them, like, if people start speaking to people at a time, I will remind you that you need to tell them to just stick one person at a time so I can interpret. Volume, stay close again, neutral volume, don't mimic, compensate with intonation. In other words, don't sound like a robot yourself if that speaker doesn't sound like a robot. But again, don't need to get overly dramatic here. And then the last part, as I said earlier, is closest to conference interpreting. It's also close to what court interpreters do during trials. This is the patient education session. So usually it is, a lecture or a discussion prepared by the provider in English. It would be heavy with subject matter terminologies. That makes it easy to prepare ahead of time. If you have that luxury, understand, not every time you'll have the opportunity to prepare ahead of time. But if you do have that chance, ask the provider for materials and do have a pre-session. Make sure that you will tell them that you will ask them to pause or clarify, because if you don't understand what the provider is saying in this case, the whole point is to educate your patient as well as every other patient in the room. So you do here have to stand firm and clarify as necessary. Yes, it's simultaneous, and hopefully you will not be interrupting the provider every sentence, but the goal is to be accurate and close to what you hear. However, because it is usually heavy on terminology or instructions, you may simplify other wording. This is the situation where you really don't need to, if you know the subject matter, it's very easy. You don't need to worry too much about the actual interpreting part of it. This grammar often is written, especially if you get a educator who will be reading their notes. That's the worst kind, because there you're pretty much doing simultaneous sight translation, really, because it's a written language. And you may simplify sentences there. You may split them, you may reword them, make active voice instead of passive. So that's all in your purview, because your communicative intent is to deliver the information and instructions to the patient, not necessarily the form in which these were delivered. Because remember, for the previous situation, when we deal with the group therapy session, that's when the atmosphere, the word choices, the form is important. Here, it's more about education. In other words, facts and instructions. Intonation, if the provider is lively, yes, stay close to the provider's intonation. But if the provider is trying to put people to sleep, I'm joking here, but seriously, then you need to do normal intonation. Do not imitate the monotonous intonation. Same thing like with the previous situation. If several speakers try to speak at the same time, intervene, ask the provider to direct them to speak one person at a time. And volume is, again, neutral volume. Now, let's talk about subskills. Well, if we think of the simultaneous interpreting, all situation except disfluent patient, let's leave that one aside. I like the quote from Eric Kamayed Freyhas, who said the following about the main principle, that interpreters should never let go of the thread of meaning. In other words, you should always kind of foresee where the speaker is going with what they're saying. Become each speaker. Restate schemas, and schema is the abstracted concept, the idea, the imagery that the speaker is using. So you just reformulate the meaning, you reconstruct the meaning of what they're saying. Translate terms. In other words, terms are those unique words that need just one-to-one equivalent word level translation, and formulate in the other language as you go. So it truly means that as interpreters, we are at a higher capacity of understanding and producing the language than simple bilingual speakers, because a bilingual speaker doesn't need to become another speaker while we do. The bilingual person does not need to restate anything we do. So that's what happens during simultaneous interpreting. And this never let go of the thread of meaning. In other words, always follow the meaning of the intended meaning of the speaker. That's what keeps you through the whole simultaneous interpreting part. Let me give you an example here. Let's talk about these schemas and terms. Here is these two sentences. When you wake up after the surgery, you will have a cannula attached to your nostrils. I don't want you to be scared. It'll supply oxygen until you can breathe on your own. So what are the terms? Can you type them up in your comments? In this whole sentence, what are the terms, the ones that you simply just need to spit out in the other language? Cannula, good. Oxygen, yep. Nostrils, yep. So surgery, cannula, nostrils, oxygen. Those are the words that you need to know exactly in your second language. Everything else are schemas. In other words, these concepts that you can reformulate and use your own words for. But these 4 words you need to know the translation of. So what happens when you're listening to these 2 sentences is your mind grabs the idea the patient is going to have a surgery. And when they wake up, they will have this thingy attached, which I still don't remember how to say in Russian at this point yet, but it's attached to the nose. It's like a tube there. And the doctor doesn't want them, no worries. The oxygen will go through that thingy and you can breathe until you breathe on your own. So that's how you unfold and reformulate these 2 sentences. Obviously, we're doing it very slow right now. In simultaneous interpreting, it happens faster, and that's just practice with skill. With practice, you will be able to unfold and reformulate as you go faster if you practice it. And so the only really tricky situation is the word cannula, but because it's connected to the word nostrils, it makes it a little easier to give you the meaning. And if you ever interpreted in healthcare, for long enough to see this actual object, it would become, yep, the Russians gave the right word, nasovaya cannula is one of the ways of saying it. Now, the difference between consecutive and simultaneous is that in simultaneous, we share attention between multiple cognitive processes at the same time. We don't have the time to fully understand the message before we start interpreting, right? Because we understand part of the message as we start interpreting it, and we understand the other part, etc. And there is a strong temptation because of that to stick to, to bypass that whole analysis of the meaning and to stick to word level interpreting. And that's what beginners usually start with. They interpret every word they hear without thinking how the words are connected. And that's not really interpretation, it's just a stream of consciousness with different words. And in some languages, it's really hard to do, like Russian, for example, because you need to know the gender, the number, the case, the conjugation of the verb. You cannot even put the string words together as you can in English until you get the meaning. So it's really is important that when you're doing simultaneous, you still preserve your attention on the meaning and not on the words. So one of the analogies I like about our brains during simultaneous is being the ocean. So you really are the ocean where these waves are these meanings coming to your forefront for attention to convert, and the shore is your listener. This broken wave is already what's delivered in Russian, Arabic, Spanish, and the speaker is behind horizon. You have no idea when they stop, how many other waves they get at you, but you know they will be coming. Your brain will process them and you will produce the meaning for the speaker. So be confident of yourself, but get into that zone of the rhythmic waves of meaning coming at you. Now, let's look at this model that Eric Keimet-Freyhus proposes. So this is what happens with our attention. We're listening to something, and about 10% of our brain is listening, just what you're hearing right now. Then we start engaging and understanding what you're hearing. Then you start abstracting. In other words, those schemas start, emerging in your brain. And then there's this moment that takes the most energy of us, is reformulating, where we change what we heard in other language. We got these ideas and we now know how to say them in the other language. And then we're actually saying them. And then it's a very important skill that often is overlooked is we're monitoring, we're listening to what we are saying. So remember, we're listening to the speaker, we're listening to ourselves, and we're doing all that. But so it's really like this, and this happens continuously. That's why we cannot do it for a long time. And as you know, the court interpreters, if they do a trial, and which is mostly done simultaneously, they work in shifts of 20-30 minutes. Conference interpreters at United Nations and other conference, again, shifts 20-30 minutes, because the brain cannot take this for a long time. And what happens after 2 hours, that's the study done in late 90s, but what happens is after 2 hours of doing simultaneous, then the monitoring goes off after about 30 minutes, and you're still delivering something, but nobody knows how good your delivery is, including yourself. So you simply don't notice the mistakes. But if you really think of what would make you a good simultaneous interpreter, look at this. This is 35%, and that is simply knowledge of the speaker's language, right? So you truly need to be bilingual, and the two languages need to be close, because 35% of that brain power goes for you to understand what the speaker says. Then if you look at it this way, abstracting and reformulating, in other words, now you have the concept in your head, that cannula picture in your head. You're looking for the word in Russian or your other language, that formulation, so that's 60%. So roughly speaking, simultaneous interpreting is successful if your both languages, English and the patient languages, are equal, because then your 60% of the brain activity is working with the same level of knowledge. But if one of these languages are not equal, that's when you're starting to slow down, because in addition to doing all this, you're searching for words, and that's hard. One more quote from Dr. Keimet-Freyhus. The process should be as natural as expressing one's own ideas, except that our inner voice, which normally feeds us thoughts, images, and schemas to verbalize, is replaced here in simultaneous interpreting by the ideas we have abstracted from the outer voice of the speaker. In a very real sense, we become the speaker, while the original speaker becomes a coach who whispers in our ear what we ought to think and say. Once we know what to say, that is, once we have formulated that segment, delivering into words and monitoring the output are comparatively mindless functions that we can put on automatic. I love this quote, as you obviously see, that's why I included it, but it truly tells you that the interpreter should be able to become the speaker. And if you think of healthcare settings, you should become the speaker of the most brilliant neurosurgeon, of a nurse, of dietitian, of the patient whose education level is the same as yours, higher than yours, lower than yours, right? So all those speakers are you. And that's why it's a very complex profession. And we need to be proud of being part of that profession. let's do a little bit more of schemas here, right? And charts. I love charts. Again, that's taken from the same, uh, work by cognitive theory of simultaneous interpreting and training. Um, there are other theories. I just like this one most, right? That's why it's important that you, after you hear me talking about simultaneous interpreting, listen to other trainers, because you get ideas that are different, and altogether you never know which style of learning will help you more. So, but stick with me here. So what's happening is we're listening. Simultaneous still is sequential, right? So when we're producing, this is the production stage, right? This is here we're hearing, listening, understanding, abstracting, etc. But here is the production stage. So when you are saying the words, remember my previous example, when you wake up, at that moment in your head, you are still processing after the surgery. And at that moment, you are hearing the speaker say you'll have a cannula. So you started saying, when you wake up, you're thinking how to say surgery in your language. You're then saying it, and then you're hearing cannula. And what happens with the uh, interpreters who haven't trained in simultaneous is that's when they start panicking. They, instead of just letting the process and cannula hit here, they already panic here while they're still saying when you wake up, they're panicking. I don't know what cannula is in my language, right? Well, they shouldn't, because that was the normal pace, right? When you hit something that is unusual for you or unusual on this day, you forgot that word today, you knew it yesterday, will know it tomorrow. At this moment, you cannot recall it. As soon as the word cannula hits your processing stage in the brain, remember the speaker is still speaking, so they'll feed you more context. And what you will be doing, you'll be doing cueing. In other words, you will take a breath, you will make a pause, because you cannot interpret cannula. At this moment, cannula means nothing to you. You cannot even think of which place of the body it will be stuck in, right? And then you hear this beautiful thing attached to your nostril, and then you can relax and you say a thing attached to your nose, right? At least you can now see where the speaker is going with it. And then, continue interpreting. So cueing is a technique that you use knowing that, you will have these waves of meaning coming at you, and some of them will be easy and you will be just going in the normal rhythm. When you are hit by the unknown concept, you should allow yourself to pause and get more context so your brain can come up with some way of restructuring it, reformulating it. And then, because you spent your time cueing at some point in your speech, you will need to also learn how to do healing. In other words, stick to every word very closely. I don't want you to be scared. All these are easy words. There is no reason for you to be in a nice rhythm. You can just say them very quickly, because you never know when the next word hits you that you don't know in the speaker, right? And that is what this whole, ocean and waves coming, and the waves are coming at you, but you can slow them down a little bit or speed them up, so that overall you are sticking within the parameters of the speaker's speech. So let's talk about the three whales, elephants, or whoever are the pillars I think the simultaneous interpreting is based on. I like elephants. So our skills really in simultaneous are shining when we have these three things under control. Depth of the language proficiency in two languages, right? English in the other language. Breadth of the language proficiency, and understanding of equivalency and meaning. So really, this is the only part which pertains to interpreting. All this is your knowledge of the language. When I think of my languages that I love, this is my native language. It's crescent like an Olympic Peninsula in Washington. It's long, it's curvy, it's murky. Who knows how I acquired it? That's my Russian. When I speak of English, it's a beautiful lake in the Rocky Mountains. This is Prague Lake. Beautiful day, beautiful lake. It's wide, it's deep, but it's contained and it's easy to grasp because it's not my native language. I know how I fed it and how I created that lake. And the language and my love and passion is French. That's my crescent lake in China. I'm so happy Chinese have this lake because it represents the lack of knowledge of French I have. But seriously, if you think of your languages that you speak and work with as these reservoirs of knowledge and understanding and culture, think they are separate. They live in you, but they are still separate, even though at some point interconnected. What makes you an interpreter is when those lakes get close to each other. So if this is your native language lake, the breadth is your vocabulary, right? And obviously that depends on your level of education in your native language. We're all different, and ask me something about these things that they use to build things with, like nuts, bolts, and other stuff. I don't know what they're called in Russian, English, or any other language. You look them up in Wikipedia or picture dictionaries. The depth of your proficiency in the native language, that's your knowledge of the structure, the grammar, the how you piece thoughts together, and the usage, all your registry, where it's formal, informal, where it's colloquial, where it's idiomatic. That's your depth of the language. So if this is your native language and your second language is always going to be like this until, I don't know, maybe, every day I find a new word I don't know in English, right? So this way I know that my breadth of English, no matter how I fool myself into thinking that I'm near native, it will never be the same as my native language. And the same thing with that breadth. You just need to recognize that. So, but the closer these two lakes are to each other, the better your simultaneous interpreting skills are. In consecutive, you can get away with a pretty big difference, because in consecutive you can clarify, you can ask the patient to reword, doctor to reword. In simultaneous, you don't have that luxury, you don't have the time for that. And for that reason, you truly need first and foremost to master your two languages to the point that they are as close to equal as possible. And you start losing your native language too. Like, all these computer things or social media terms in Russian. When I hear my, niece and nephew talk, and they're not even teenagers anymore, they are in their 30s, I still don't know the Russian words they're using, because I did not have Одноклассники, Vkontakte, Facebook, Twitter when I grew up in Russia. So again, they will never be the same, but this is something that you need to consciously work at. Equivalency of meaning is something that we really need to study and learn and master as interpreters, and that's what makes us different from bilingual speakers. Think of the simple word football. If you're not born in the United States, this is what you think about. And if you're born in the United States, this is what you think about it, right? So when you interpret the American provider saying football shaped something or other, you will not use the word football in your language, right? Your meaning will be either egg-shaped. So the word the doctor says, oh, your eye is shaped as a football now because of astigmatism. You will say in your language, your eye is an egg shape now. But if the patient says, like, I have this something under my skin, it's small, but it's like a little football, and that same word football, the equivalent meaning will be like, it's like a ball, like a round, like an apple, right? So that's what equivalency is. It's not the words, it's these meanings. And that's what you need to always know, what the meaning is of the speaker, so that then you convey that meaning that is equal, and they really speak about the same thing and not about two different things. So what knowledge do we need? We need to be successful in simultaneous interpreting and interpreting in general. Health literacy, not even healthcare, but just in general health literacy, both in the United States aspect of it and is in patient's culture. We need to know the communicative intent of the specific discourse. In other words, the most important thing for us is, in this case, is how important the words are. If the words are not that important, then you can allow yourself more time. You can allow yourself to use more somethings, right, in your simultaneous interpreting. But if the words are important, like they are in group therapy sessions, that's when you have to shine. Terminology, obviously, idioms, vocabulary use, cultural significance, yeah, all that good stuff, which is like one line, but you know how many years of study that is, right? Structure and grammar of the working languages. So we need to also have fluency, in other words, being articulate in both languages, source and target. You need to be able to hear and understand dialects, including different English dialects. I don't know about you, but my first waking up to the fact that Americans speak with different dialects was in the airport, when I had to have a couple of connections, and they supposedly pronounced what the gate is and when we're boarding in English. But oh my God, that had not sound like anything that I studied in English when I studied in English in Russia. So train your ear to listen to as many English speakers. And if English is your native language, then you need to train your ear to listen and hear and understand as many patient language speakers as possible. Concentration, attention span. For simultaneous interpreting, it's crucial. You truly have to be focused and hear, not think what they want to say, but really hear what they are saying, because that's what we're about. I can comment here about interpreters or candidates who fail our exams. When we listen to their recordings, they failed not because they didn't know the term, or like their English was bad or their Spanish was bad. No, apparently they were not able to concentrate enough to hear what was said. It's omissions. People omit things because they simply don't focus enough and listen to the words that the speaker is saying. Listening actively and analytically. In other words, you need to think of the schemas, of the concepts of the speaker, and anticipate what may be coming. Of course, anticipation does not apply to disfluent patients, psychotic moments. You need to be very good at analysis of the source language. You need to be able to abstract and chunk, to think like, okay, he mentions he's thinking three things, I need to produce three things. You need to be good at formulating. In other words, your breadth of vocabulary and target language should be at the tip of your tongue. And of course, our short-term memory. The good thing about the simultaneous interpreting is it's really short. You will, because you're concentrating on doing all this, when you leave, you sometimes even cannot tell what it is that you were interpreting for, because you really don't need to remember all that. You need to only focus on remembering what you just heard, what you are hearing, and what you actually are about to say. Then note-taking, especially for patient education sessions, for group therapy sessions sometimes, and for anything else, including in consecutive mode, where you have names, medications, numbers. Note-taking is important. So as you clearly see, there are plenty of things to work on if you want to improve your simultaneous. As I've already mentioned several times, maintaining accuracy is the key one. Don't forget that accuracy also includes register, in other words, the formality of the language. And one of the, I think, under-trained, or the skills that is we're not training as much, is self-monitoring. It is a skill that differentiates us from bilingual speakers. When we're speaking, we're really not listening to what we're saying. We're relying on that listener to tell us like, oh, did you mean really that? But when you're interpreting, you really need to make sure you're saying exactly what you think you're saying. And when you hear your slips of the tongue, when you hear the mistakes, you need to correct yourself. So another skill is to be able to correct yourself quickly, effectively, without, it's not a big deal. Everybody makes mistakes. So you don't need to apologize. You need to listen to newscasters, how they correct their mistakes, right? It's they sometimes even don't admit a mistake. They just restate the opposite of what they just said, right? Without saying what I mean is. However, it's okay to say what I mean is, but make it quick, because in simultaneous, you don't have the time to add those extra words. Oh, I'm so sorry, I mistranslated this term. I wanted to say, what you're saying is gallbladder, correction, bladder, and continue, right? The word correction is a good word. Use it, correction, and then just correct yourself and move on. Reducing your accent, because if you're interpreting simultaneously, you really need to be confident that people are not going to stop you every time and say, what did you just say? I didn't understand a word, right? So your accents should be intelligible. I don't say that you should get rid of your accent completely. We all love our accents, but you need to be intelligible to the listener, so they don't interrupt your flow of simultaneous interpreting. And then keep the pace, intonation, and prosody of the speaker. Not always the pace, because sometimes you'll be, remember, cueing, sometimes you'll be healing, but the prosody, the stress, the making it emphatic, when they make it emphatic, that's important. And then maintaining transparency. If you need to intervene, you do. And you need to be very quick at doing it. Again, you don't have the time as in consecutive to explain. You just need to stick with interpret and its clarification, blah, blah, blah. So be and train in front of the window saying these things, because until you really are comfortable with doing these quick interventions, you won't be able to, to do them in simultaneous mode. So what we're going to do now, we're going to do some other practice, but before that, let's just review some terms so you're not getting stuck on those. So PICC line, peripherally inserted central catheter. Think for a second, how would you say it in your language? Don't type it in or anything, just think. And try to really make it PICC line and not an IV. The next one is O negative blood. Think of how you say different blood types. This is the most universal one, but the one which has that negative factor to it. Transfusion, right? When we are transferring blood which was donated to the patient. And not necessarily blood, but in this case it'll be blood. Painkiller, not killing anybody except the pain. IV, as a noun, in other words, that tube that delivers medication to the patient through the vein. CT scan, computer tomography, X-rays, in other words, assisted with computer. Lower back, in many languages there's a different word than back for that specific region. That's the one which hurts most for me. So I know my Russian word very well. Now, before we go to practice, let's do some reformulation or paraphrasing. So if I read this first sentence, that's the original line, what would be the closest restatement of it? Closest in meaning. We are going to put a breathing tube and a PICC line. A, we'll put a tube for you to breathe and a catheter for medication. And B, we'll put a tube through your mouth so you can breathe, and another one for medication into your blood vessel on the arm. All right. Yeah, C is cute. B, the correct answer is B, because the breathing tube, yes, it is for you to breathe. However, part of it is the purpose to show that it goes through your mouth. It's not a cannula, right? And so a tube for you to breathe may be a cannula too. So, and this one is more specific. And again, obviously in the simultaneous interpreting, you won't have time to analyze that. You just need to know what the breathing tube is word-wise, term-wise in your language. Now, the PICC line, again, it is a catheter, but it's not always for medication. It sometimes is used for, it just a simplified catheter for medication may work for some languages of lesser diffusion, which don't have the set terms, etc. But still, the closer is that it's a tube that is going into your blood vessel on the arm. and then it actually goes all the way to the heart, right? So it's a little bit of this difference of where it is inserted is important for the PICC line. Just a catheter for medication, it could go into the stomach, right? So the differences, those are the why the B is a better choice. Now, the next one. You've lost some blood. We are starting blood transfusion. You don't have enough blood. We're beginning to add donor's blood. Or, because you have been bleeding, we're adding donor's blood to your body. Yay, everybody is saying B. That's right, because what the heck is you don't have enough blood, right? So it's very important. And sometimes those are the mistakes you'll actually make, right? Be prepared, because we're not all perfect. And we're not perfect all the time. That's what I meant to say. I know we're not perfect. But we're not perfect all the time. And so sometimes as soon as you catch that you said something like that, make sure that you correct yourself. The next one. I'm going to stitch the cut on your left arm. A. You have a cutting wound on your left arm and I'm going to sew it up. B. I'll put stitches on your left arm. Nice mix. A, B, A, B, A, B. All right. A. Just for a change, right? No, but seriously, omission. Stitches on your left, you limited the word cut. I know in the long scheme of things, it's not that big deal in this particular situation, right? But as an interpreter, you should pride yourself on interpreting actually everything you hear. And cutting wound, yeah, it is longer and then simultaneous, but we're not doing an exercise right now, right? So it's not really something that you may be saying, but omission sometimes is worse than making it clear or explicitation, like cutting wood or cut wood, that's wound, those are the explicitations. Number 4, we're giving you a painkiller through the IV. You will feel no pain soon. A, we're giving you pain medicine intravenously. You will have no pain soon. Or B, we're giving you medicine for pain into your blood. You will feel better soon. I say majority is A. Yep. Here is a little word, better. That's the addition. The doctor didn't say you will feel better. They said you will feel no pain. So be careful with these little words, because especially in the context of healthcare, right? Nobody is going to feel you. I mean, not often you will hear providers promise things, you will feel better, etc. They will pretty much stick to the facts, what will happen. And that's what, especially on the exam, luckily most of you I know here on the webinar today are certified already, but if you're a candidate, this better will get you into more trouble because you actually changed the meaning here. Now, number 5, we're going to do a CT scan now to see your lower back. A, we will now do a computer x-ray so we can see your back. Or B, we will now look at your lower spine with the help of the computer x-ray machine. Yep, B it is. Again, back and lower back. For many of you young people, it's not a big difference. I can tell you my lower back is the weakest spot in my whole body. So seriously though, again, these little words, we know everybody could say them, but it's important that you actually do say them. And that's what understanding that, do this exercise with yourself. You know, try to create these different paraphrases that critique which would be closer, which is farther, and why, because that's how you train your brain to understand equivalency better. Because if you do it in one language and you can see what's equivalent and it's not, then you will know which word to pick in the other language to better interpret the statement. And it's much better than playing Sudoku on the plane or on the waiting line. So seriously, do the paraphrasing, paraphrase the whole article you're reading or document. So this way you will be really practicing your brain muscles. So now again, I'm going to read to you a scene from a trauma ER moment, and you need to interpret it simultaneously into your non-English language: Spanish, Arabic, Farsi, Mandarin, Chinese. I've seen several of different languages here. So French, so one French person. Okay, 1, 2, 3. We're going to put a breathing tube and a PICC line, okay? I need O negative blood, O negative blood. You've lost some blood. We're starting blood transfusion. I'm going to stitch the cut on your left arm. We're giving you a painkiller through the IV. You will feel no pain soon. Another team is working on your son. He is alive. Don't worry now. We're going to do a CT scan now to see your lower back. We have to operate on your spine. You'll be under general anesthesia. I'm putting a mask, and after I count to 4, you'll be asleep. 1, 2, 3, 4. Do you hear me? Open your eyes. Move your lids. She's out. She's ready. Yep, Nepal is it. Okay, so I think this exercise should have felt a little better, right? Than the unicorn and onions, and because first we already talked about the terms, right? We already played with the sentences. So my whole point of this pre-interpreting exercise was to show you that when you are prepared for the subject matter, simultaneous is no harder than consecutive. But when you're not, that's when it's additional stress. So here are just a couple of slides showing you some Spanish and Russian. I'm sorry, guys, my other language, Spanish is not me. If it's wrong, it's not me. It was my friend who interpreted it into Spanish, but just showing you about what it would look like. I'm not going to read them. I'm just going to let you read them yourself. That was the first sentence. Now the second about O negative blood. And then you've lost some blood. We're starting blood transfusion. I'm going to stitch the cut on your left arm. We're giving you a painkiller through the IV. You will feel no pain soon. Another team is working on your son. He is alive. We're going to do a CT scan now to see your lower back. Yeah, the O negative, seronegative. I had a discussion and I see majority says O negative, but if they're all, I also saw zero too. So sorry, guys. Different countries. Maybe the country, and the majority, I know it's I'm speaking, in case anybody is wondering, there are lots of comments from the Spanish interpreters on how to interpret O negative blood into Spanish, whether it's the letter O or whether it's 0. I can tell you in Russian it's group number 1. So it's not even a 0 or an O. All right, the last one. We have to operate on your spine. You'll be under general anesthesia. I'm putting a mask, and after I count to 4, you will be asleep. 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. She's out. She's ready. And obviously, you almost don't need to interpret she's out, she's ready, because by that time, the person to whom you're interpreting is not hearing you. But it's just like your residual mind will say it. No, seriously, guys, search back to Spanish about O negative. Do the Google search in Spanish. Type it in Spanish to different countries, and you will see there is 0 in a couple of countries. Now, let's do. Let me see. Yes, we can have a couple of minutes for another exercise. This time without preparation. So again, I'm going to read it and you are going to interpret simultaneously. And this time we're dealing with a group therapy session. And so there's no terminology here. It's really easy language-wise, but pay attention to the sentence structure and hesitations that some people will have here. Okay, 1, 2, 3. I'd like everyone to comment on what is going on here today. Your thoughts, feelings. I'm a little worried about Alice. She's very quiet today. You're just sitting there. Well, it takes me a while to get comfortable and start talking. It just seems so intense here. Every word means something. I'm just frustrated of what others think about me. I saw you smiling earlier. I felt like you were judging me. Judgmental? No, I didn't feel that. I felt she just didn't want to be put on the spot. Well, Alan, I watched you during the introductions and it seemed that you didn't let Alice talk much. Yes, I thought you, Alan, wanted all the spotlight to yourself. Alice, how did you feel about all that? Oh, that's not true. I don't want any spotlight. I'm very shy. In fact, I always come to the parties late, so I don't attract attention. Okay, that was another thing. So that's just a little taste of what the group therapy session will be like, right? It's really not necessarily deep all the time. Sometimes it's just these statements, but yet they are still challenging. I know, because you're jumping from different speakers and some will choose this spotlight, like what the heck, who the heck thinks of the word spotlight, right? So you never know really what to expect. That's the main challenge in Simultaneous. So how do you improve and train beyond what we already did today? So, well, first of all, let's think of the perfect Simultaneous. What it is when we interpret, we have exact equivalents for terms of art, expressions, idioms. We don't add anything, we don't explain anything, we don't omit anything. And we maintain the speaker register and we complete sentences, speak in complete sentences with the target language grammar. In other words, we don't make Arabic sentences sounding English, right? We put the correct word order. And same thing for Chinese and for Russian. We pace ourselves as the speaker does. We have proper intonation. This is all very great, and that's exactly what you need to do. But I can tell you, we all could do it certain times of the day, but we're not going to do it 100% every single time. It's the sad reality. You need to acknowledge that and work within these limitations, right? Because you will not know all terms for all healthcare encounters. Sometimes, naturally, because you're stuck on the word, you will start ending up explaining yourself. You will omit things because you'll be stressed out and you will just decide, okay, I'm skipping that because it's not that important. I will just keep up with the rest. With the register, same thing. You will slide to the neutral register. You will repeat the words in the order they came at you in English if you were interpreting from English, not thinking that in your language they actually need to start with a different clause, right? So the reason I'm not being here sarcastic. I just want you to be realistic. Simultaneous is possible, and conference interpreters who do a lot of trials, they're really good at it because they work within these parameters. If you think of simultaneous interpreters for United Nations, they usually get at different degrees in that specialty they interpret for, whether it's environmental science or nuclear weapons or anything else, right? They often interpret only for those topics and nothing else. They get the written speeches ahead of time. They still interpret what they hear, but that's when it becomes that perfect. In healthcare settings, when you don't know what's coming at you, it's almost by definition impossible. But what we are striving to do is to keep the meaning and to keep the situational intent and do it to the best of our ability. So this is your ideal that you could do every day for a couple of minutes. You can do that, but you will not be able to do it for 8 hours every single day, right? So keep that in mind. So what we're ending up instead of, one of the challenges, especially when you're a beginner, is not managing décalage properly. In other words, you're staying too close to the speaker and because you are afraid to forget something. You're afraid that if you will let the speaker talk too long, then you will fall behind and will never catch up. Well, the good thing is there is always an end to the doctor's appointment, right? So eventually you'll have to leave that room. So they'll have to listen to what you will be catching up on. So this fear should not exist in your mind. There is a very real fear that you will not notice and correct your mistakes, but if you're training to listen to yourself, you should trust yourself, you will. So as a result, what happens is the beginner interpreters and simultaneous, they're focusing on individual words and not on chunks of meanings. And so it's really hard to understand them. The words are there. It's like, Google Translate, right? You type in a nice sentence in one language and you get a bunch of words which kind of make sense and you can piece them together. That's what simultaneous interpreting of a beginner sounds like Google Translate. Oftentimes, the result is that you're repeating disconnected blocks of meaning. In other words, you're kind of making a little bit more sense. That's actually good, right? That's the next step. You're actually already speaking in meanings of blocks. You just didn't connect them grammatically yet. And these incomplete sentences, something that you need to work towards. And then sometimes your source language, your English, especially if it's your weak language, will dominate your native language in simultaneous, because you'll start repeating words that don't exist in your language. English, the word, I always remember this funny episode during an exercise I had with a student. So it was into Spanish. The word bills became biles, right? So that's not how you say it in Spanish. So things like that may start happening. Another part of when you are not confident as a simultaneous interpreter is when you're not maintaining accuracy, especially register. You start adding things instead of giving exact equivalents. And in real life, really, it's not a big problem. You're just robbing yourself of some time and you make your mind work harder, but it's not bad. The only problem, you may get yourself into trouble on the exam with that if you add a little bit too much. Your register slides to neutral in the non-native language. In other words, like my native language is Russian, in simultaneous, after some time, I will be speaking in neutral English instead of the English of the speaker. And if it is into my Russian in my native language, then I'll start sounding at my level of education, which is pretty educated, even if the patient is uneducated, because that's what's comfortable for us, right? So that's what, the dangers are here. And I love talking about register. I strongly believe that as interpreters need to strive to maintain register. However, sliding to neutral is not necessarily the worst errors you could make in simultaneous. Your worst error is when you change the meaning. But sliding to neutral register, just forgive yourself for that encounter and pick up the next time. Not monitoring your output. That's the worst enemy of us. When you don't hear your own errors, when he becomes she and you never knew that, right? My husband keeps telling me that I mix those two up, and I say, no, I don't, but I probably do. So because I'm not interpreting when I speak with my husband, I'm just producing speech. As interpreters, you really need to monitor your output. Too many self-corrections. Well, first of all, that doesn't produce confidence in you, right? If you keep saying, what I mean, sorry, I meant, that's not good. But secondly, if they're long and simultaneous, you are not, when you are saying these self-corrections, you are getting out of that wave by wave mode. Instead, you are producing speech completely not said by anybody. It interrupts your concentration. So you need to be really fast with your self-corrections. Choppy pace. That's really hard to listen if you don't understand a word of English and you hear only the simultaneous interpreter and they're really all over the place with their pace of speech. That's hard. And intonation, either anxious or monotonous. Monotonous is not too bad when it's anxious, when your voice starts, like trembling. That's how I start my public speech, not webinars. Webinars I got used to, but next time you watch me at the conference, my first minute, my voice is trembling, etc. Then it picks up. Same thing happens with me when I interpret simultaneously. So I try to kind of, do some prep before time speak so that I can get my voice and anxiety under control, because we're all anxious when we do that. Recognize it doesn't matter how many years you did it. It's still a new patient, new situation. So but you need to be able to monitor it. So be aware that anxious intonation may mess up the understanding of the listener. So what kind of exercises could you do? Text analysis. Just grab any text from newspaper to magazines to documents to literature, and then do parsing, chunking, organize, identify key ideas, what is secondary, what is primary, memory development. You need to be able to very comfortably repeat 35 words as an interpreter. Of course, when they make sense, Again, disfluent patient aside. Disfluent patient, you're just healing there. You're repeating every word you hear. But with normal speech, you need to be able to store maybe 10 words before you can start interpreting. But the other important thing is to practice clearing the cache. In other words, you said something, don't keep it in your mind for too long. Clear it, because your mind needs to do other things. So don't try to remember everything when you're interpret. Attention span increase and concentration, comprehension exercises, and speed. Just time yourself interpreting the same thing over and over again and see if you get faster. You will. It's like with, the beauty of any skill is that the more you do it, the better you get at it. Of course, if you do it correctly. Think of, I'm pretty sure in every country, let me take this back. In any non-refugee environment, right? We all were taught how to play basketball, right? Not many of us became LeBron James. I'm not LeBron James by any means, but it's because we were practicing, right? It's not like we were not practicing, but we were not taught exactly how to throw that ball that hits it the right way, whether you step with the right foot, whether you just have your knees bent or not. You don't know all these details because you're not a professional basketball player, but you are a professional interpreter. So you need to know that practicing text analysis, chunking and memory development will improve your interpreting skills. That's something you need to know. When your weak spot is actually delivering simultaneous, not necessarily understanding, then try paraphrasing. That exercise we did today. Summarizing. Do yourself recording of speech on different subjects. Give yourself parameters. I'm going to speak about 1 minute about XYZ, and then record that speech and then interpret yourself. So because this way your brain will practice different ways of dealing with the subject matter. If you have the language transfer skills you remember those two different lakes and one is much smaller than the other, you still need to be able to transfer the meaning from one lake to the other. You need to read more about the subject matter in both languages. Find parallel text, parallel YouTube videos in different languages on the same healthcare topic, and that would help you. Shadow with paraphrasing. In other words, many court interpreters practicing by, listening, let's say, to a sitcom or newscast and just repeating the same thing in English. Do it a step harder. Don't just repeat it, but paraphrase what you heard. try doing it in your head when you're arguing with somebody and just restate what you just heard. That's what I mean. This will calm you down, but it also keeps you focused on the accuracy of meaning. Because you are still practicing, right? You just have the luxury of do the same speech in different ways. So do it in 3 different ways. First, do it at different times of the day. If you're a night owl, it will be easier for you to do it in the evening. Force yourself to try to interpret the same speech in the morning when you just woke up. Because the harder, you do it when you're practicing, the easier you will handle the situation, unexpected situations on the job. Do it in different locations. It's a myth that you should study in the same room at the same desk. No. Actually, our brains like variety, so try studying at home, then go outside, or take it during your commute and practice at the same time. Just don't drive and do simultaneous interpreting. No. That's too dangerous. And then practice with different music, because you're never quiet in healthcare settings, right? There's always other noise. It doesn't have to be Mozart. I mean, studies proven it doesn't matter what it is, jazz, rock, whatever. It just needs to be something rhythmic that actually creates that rhythm and waves in your brain that helps you with, interpreting. Do some interruptions. Don't do it every day. I know you won't, but I'm just still warning you, because actually we need breaks to process information. Remember, all these beautiful inventions were done after people, slept a good night's sleep and all that good stuff. So having this consciously set practice of any skill in your interpreting will help you. Here is a couple of more, suggestions. Let's say day 1, you found a speech, and it'll be a speech about asthma, and you record yourself interpreting that. Listen to it, compare with the original, try to identify errors. There are many standard tools. If you do a search for U of Westminster, they actually have like a nice questionnaire of what interpreters should look for in their interpretation. And give yourself a break a day from then, listen to that speech again, and instead of recording yourself, just paraphrase it into the source language, and then find a text or a video on the same topic in your target language. So your first video was in English. Now find on the same subject a YouTube video in Russian and see, just listen to it, and you will see like, that's how they say it. Read an article about this. So in other words, these are your days of interpreting. These are the days of your preparatory exercises. If the text that you first recorded had some terms you never knew, look them up in the dictionary, consult, find the correct translation, and then just summarize it or retell it in both languages quickly. So you're playing with the subject matter. You're getting your brain to be comfortable with that subject matter that you first interpreted into. And then after this, quiet time away from interpreting, but still working on that same subject matter, interpret the same speech again and record yourself and listen, and you should be good. If you're not, if you still think that there are still too many errors, you still didn't, you need to identify your weak spots. Until you identify your weak spots, you will never know how to work them out, right? How to improve them. So if you notice that you are omitting things, that, you simply just didn't say certain things, that's your concentration, right? If you noticed that really they meant something different than what you were saying, and you continue saying it wrong, then there's something wrong maybe with your actual level of proficiency in both languages or the subject matter. So before fully, dismissing it, give yourself a break, and then find a different speech but on the same topic and repeat the same things, and then theoretically you should get better. 99% of you will, but I'm sure there will be 1% of us who won't. And that's when you have to ask yourself hard questions. Is it the subject matter? In other words, simply medical stuff doesn't stick in your head, right? Or it is the difference in the depth and breadth of your lakes of the two languages, English and the other language. Then you need to work on that first before you can improve your simultaneous. And it's okay. As long as when you know your own diagnosis, you know how to work on improving it. Now, I want to remind you that if you look in your controls on the webinar panel, there is the PDF file with the slides, and it includes this slide, which has references and suggested reading. And we are going to be open for questions now.